Thank you, David, for speaking so pungently and concisely so that it leaves us some time after our fourth speaker to take a few questions from the audience. So let's pass on straight away to Miguel Maduro.
Thank you very much. If I had been asked a month ago if I expected to be at this conference, I would have said yes, but not in my current capacity. But since, even if I've been in government now for 3 weeks, my ideas, my colleagues at the UI will be happy or unhappy to find out have not changed much about the European Union. David Miliband just said that the delivery deficit of the Union is actually more important than the democratic deficit. But a good part of my comments are actually focused on the idea that the delivery deficit is actually a big part, of the democratic deficit of the European Union. I've always believed for some time now that too much of the democratic deficit and the democratic discourse on Europe has been focused on institutions, and too little of the democratic deficit and the democratic discourse has paid attention to policies and politics in the European Union. I think that the question of democracy in Europe can not only be linked to institutions and accountability, because the idea of self-government itself is linked to broader issues of justice that we have failed to address so far in Europe, and that to a large extent explain the difficulty that Europe and its peoples have had in dealing with the current crisis. I would say that the democratic and political legitimacy of the European Union and the Economic and Monetary Union is also dependent on a fair distribution of the costs and benefits of economic integration and monetary union. And this is particularly important because the interdependence that is generated by economic and monetary integration itself impacts on the capacity for self-government, and therefore to secure those conditions of justice in government that used to be the domain of national democracies. The tax autonomy of a state is challenged by tax competition, and therefore the capacity that states in the European Union have to determine how burdens are shared among all their citizens. A state's wrong fiscal policy and budget policies can produce important externalities on other states and therefore affect the capacity for self-government of those other states. But in the same way, the systemic conditions created by monetary union can also exacerbate the consequences of those wrong policies and make it more difficult even for those states to correct them. What Emma Marcegaglia just mentioned regarding the current financial fragmentation and how that makes it very difficult for states like my own under the adjustment processes to correct and benefit from the reforms and policies that we have undertaken. All this underlies that the deep forms of integration that we have developed in the European Union impact on the capacity for self-government of individual states. And both this impact on national self-government and on the capacity of states to produce certain public goods and secure social justice, and at the same time the redistributive effects of European integration will already generate claims for self-government and social justice at EU level. This must be addressed in a variety of ways. The first one, a very important one at the moment, I believe, is that we need a balance, as President Monti actually mentioned, between fiscal discipline and fiscal capacity at the European level. Fiscal discipline is very important. It's important from the point of view of states themselves, but it's also very important to reinstate mutual trust between European states and their public opinions. But the other side of this equation must be fiscal capacity. That is, the European Union must be in a position to correct the asymmetric shocks that result and are a natural consequence in the context of a monetary and economic union, and must be in a position to guarantee a fair distribution of the costs and benefits when such shocks occur. A second necessary condition that we need to satisfy is that the political and social legitimacy of the European Union cannot result from the Union only imposing sanctions and discipline. It must also provide positive incentives. And again, as President Monti mentioned, the idea of the contractual arrangements is a positive sign in that direction, and I hope one that will be rendered concrete. But as I said, if the democratic challenges involves policies and requires changes in EU policies, it also requires changes in EU politics. And I want to conclude by addressing three challenges in this respect. The first one is that a democratic union needs to be an effective union. The idea of self-government entails the capacity to govern. And one of the big challenges to the idea of self-government in Europe is that it is not proving itself capable of providing sufficient governance. One way of addressing this is by providing EU institutions with stronger political capital. The link, for example, between the election of the President of the European Commission and the elections for the European Parliament may be a step forward in that direction, because it will provide such President of the Commission with a political capital and with a clear political mandate following the program discussed in European genuine elections. A second step in that, a second challenge that I believe it's important to address is that the European Democratic Union requires a European political space. One of the problems that has hindered the capacity of the Union to effectively respond to its current crisis is because that even if decisions need to be taken at European level, they depend deeply on national political spaces that have not internalized the consequences of interdependence. As a consequence, they provide the wrong political incentives for actions at European level. So we need a European political space not to replace national political spaces, but to complement those national political spaces. We also need stronger cross-border politics. We need political divisions in Europe not to be only along national lines. And again, the proposal, for example, to link the election of the President of the European Commission with the next European Parliament elections, something that my government has already defended in the past, is a step in the right direction. Finally, something that is of deep interest to Stefano, that has often focused the extent to which there is a very high risk if the Union is perceived only as an instrument of discipline. I think that the extent to which the Union is imposing discipline on its member states must be compensated by increased political choice at EU level. The European Union cannot be perceived by its citizens to be only about discipline and sanctions. It must offer a possibility for political choice. And in this respect, let me conclude, having lived in Florence and maybe and hopefully being able to return back to Florence in a few years, with an author that I often cite, and it's Florentine author, Dante. In the Divine Comedy of Dante, most of you, if not all of you, will know that is accompanied through the different levels of purgatory and hell by Virgil, that is the Roman poet and the embodiment of reason. But Virgil cannot enter with Dante into paradise because people that are endowed only with reason cannot enter into paradise. And the person that welcomes Dante in paradise is Beatrice. That is the love of his life. In this, I've always believed that Dante offers us a metaphor about life, but that is also a metaphor about politics and democracy. We need the right mix between reason and passion, and that is what the European Union needs to find. Thank you very much.